A single sentence. 7 words. Spoken not in anger, not in a war room, not in front of generals with ribbons on their chests. Spoken by the President of the United States, in a meeting with corporate executives, with cameras rolling, with markets listening. 7 words that redefined what America thinks a human being is worth. Computers don't need visas. Pause. Read that again. Not, we need to reform our immigration system. Not, we should prioritize American-born workers. Not even, we're reviewing our trade agreements with Canada. Computers don't need visas. In those 4 syllables, computers, the President of the United States had just told the world something that no economist dared to model, no diplomat dared to predict, and no allied government had ever expected to hear from Washington. He had just told the world that people skilled, certified, trained, contributing human beings were a procurement problem, a line item, a cost center, something to be replaced. And the country he aimed that sentence at was not China, not Russia, not Iran. It was Canada, the longest undefended border in human history. The nation that has fought beside America in every major conflict for over a century. The country whose engineers build American pipelines, whose nurses staff American hospitals, whose programmers write the code that runs American technology companies. That country. And what happened next in the months that followed that 7-word declaration will be studied in economics departments, diplomatic academies, and business schools for decades. Because what Trump started with, computers don't need visas, was not a labor policy. It was not an immigration reform. It was not even a trade dispute. It was something far more dangerous. It was an experiment in whether the most powerful nation on earth could weaponize its arrogance and survive the answer. To understand what happened, you have to understand the trap that was set, not by Canada, by Washington itself. For decades, quietly, efficiently, invisibly, the North American economy had been running on a system of integrated human capital that most Americans never thought about, never read about, and certainly never voted on. Canadian engineers crossed the border every Monday morning to keep Michigan's electric vehicle factories running. Canadian nurses clocked into hospitals in New York, Minnesota, and Maine, filling shifts that American healthcare systems simply could not staff with domestic workers alone. Canadian software developers held trade national visas and sat in cubicles in Cupertino and Seattle, writing code for products used by billions. Canadian financial analysts in Toronto ran investment chains that moved capital across both economies in real time. This was not charity. This was not a favor Canada was doing for America. This was interdependence, the quiet machinery of a shared continental economy that had been built, brick by brick, agreement by agreement, over more than 5 decades. And then came Article 34.7. Washington announced it was reviewing whether to renew USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, during the July review window. The conditions for renewal: open Canada's dairy sector, relax softwood lumber controls, accept new tariff mechanisms on goods from unfriendly nations, and most provocatively of all, restructure the cross-border labor visa framework. In Ottawa, the announcement landed like a structural shock, because what Washington was really saying, underneath the trade language, beneath the policy footnotes, was this: we are reconsidering whether Canadian workers belong in America at all. Trump made it explicit, almost immediately, almost eagerly. In a closed-door meeting with U.S. Commerce Department officials and Department of Homeland Security leadership, he repeated a question that would become the philosophical backbone of his entire economic strategy. He said, and these are his words, "If Americans can use AI to replace accountants, software engineers, and data analysts, why are we still dependent on Canadian labor?" That question, that single casually delivered question in a government conference room, became the foundation for a complete restructuring of how the United States would treat its northern neighbor. Within weeks, the Department of Homeland Security submitted a new regulatory package: Canadian university degrees, the same degrees that had been automatically recognized for decades, would no longer receive default equivalency status. Canadian workers seeking employment in the United States would now be required to demonstrate a minimum of 3 years of specialized experience, or hold certifications in fields that, and this is the specific language used, the American market cannot yet supply domestically. Visa application fees increased sharply. American companies wishing to hire Canadian nationals were now required to pay an additional American worker training contribution fee, hundreds of dollars per application per worker. And simultaneously, Trump signed a massive federal budget allocation for vocational training programs across the United States. He appeared at a rally in Pennsylvania. He looked into the crowd of working-class Americans, people who were angry about inflation, angry about stagnant wages, angry about a globalized economy that felt like it had left them behind, and he said, "Why should we wait for someone from Toronto, when we can train a young man right here in Pennsylvania to do the same job faster and more loyal?" The crowd erupted, and Trump understood exactly what he was doing. He was not making an economic argument. He was making an identity argument. He He was telling millions of Americans that their struggles, their real, painful, legitimate economic struggles were the fault of a system that had allowed foreigners to take what was rightfully theirs. He was giving them a face for their frustration. And that face was Canadian. What made this calculation so dangerous and so revealing was not the policy itself. Policies can be revised. Agreements can be renegotiated. What made it dangerous was what it said about how the White House now viewed the relationship between nations and their people. In one meeting with American technology CEOs, Trump reportedly slapped his hand on the table. He said, "You keep complaining about an engineer shortage, but you're investing billions in AI. If AI is as good as you say it is, use it to replace the Canadians." The room went silent. These were the leaders of the most powerful technology companies in human history, and they understood in that silence that the President of the United States was not speaking in hyperbole. He genuinely believed that artificial intelligence was ready to replace the skilled human labor that held the North American economy together. He genuinely believed that a border could be closed to people without consequences for commerce. He genuinely believed that loyalty to a flag was a more valuable professional qualification than years of certified expertise. And that belief, that spectacular, catastrophic misunderstanding of how modern economies actually work, was about to be tested in the most expensive laboratory in the world, the United States of America. In Ottawa, Mark Carney did not react the way Trump expected. He did not hold an emergency press conference. He did not rage on television. He did not post on social media. He did not escalate rhetorically. He sat in the Prime Minister's office, quietly, looking at energy flow maps and North American trade data on his screen. And he said something in a cabinet meeting, in a voice that was described by everyone present as almost unnervingly calm, that reframed the entire conflict in a single sentence. He said, "Donald Trump thinks borders are where people cross, but modern economies run on electricity, data, oil, and minerals." And then he pointed at a map that showed something most Americans had never been told. 25% of the clean electricity powering New York and New England flows from Canadian hydroelectric sources. Not 10%, not a marginal contribution. 1/4 of the electricity lighting homes, running hospitals, powering data centers, and charging electric vehicles in the northeastern United States comes from Canada. The room was silent, and then Carney said 5 words. Energy can also be a weapon. He did not say that to the press. He did not post it on social media. He said it in a cabinet meeting, in private. But what followed was not private. What followed was what Canadian journalists came to call balance sheet warfare, a method of economic combat so sophisticated, so precisely calibrated, that it would take Washington months to even recognize it was happening. Canada began signing direct mineral access agreements with American corporations, Tesla, Intel, companies that depended on lithium, nickel, and cobalt to manufacture the products that defined the future of American technological competitiveness. But embedded in each agreement, quietly, legally, contractually, was a condition. If these companies wanted preferential access to Canadian critical minerals at competitive pricing, they would need to advocate with Washington for the relaxation of Canadian worker visa restrictions. Read that again. Carney did not fight Trump directly. He did not sanction American goods. He did not ban American citizens. He did not make a single public threat. Instead, he turned America's own most powerful corporations into a pressure campaign aimed at the White House. He made the business community do the work. He made the market deliver the message that no diplomat could. And then, in a single press conference, brief, precise, devastating, he delivered the line that stopped markets mid-session and ran on the front page of every financial publication in the Western world. He looked into the camera. He said, "Donald, you can close your borders to people, but you cannot close your borders to electrons." 6 words directed at the economic consequences of every threat Trump had made, not an insult. Because embedded in those 6 words was a truth that every energy trader, every grid operator, and every infrastructure analyst in North America already knew. If Canada adjusted its cross-border energy transmission pricing by even a small percentage, the cost of electricity and gasoline in the northeastern United States would spike within weeks, not months. Weeks. Wall Street heard it, bond markets heard it, currency traders heard it, and the response was immediate. The consequences did not arrive slowly. They arrived the way structural failures always arrive, first gradually, then suddenly. In Michigan, a single electric vehicle assembly line shut down, not because of a strike, not because of mechanical failure, because 4 Canadian engineers with specialized certifications in EV battery system integration that fewer than 300 people in North America hold, were detained at the Windsor-Detroit border crossing under the new DHS screening protocols. 4 people. A production line that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in manufacturing capacity stopped. EV sector stocks dropped. In Pennsylvania, a nuclear facility postponed a scheduled maintenance shutdown indefinitely. The Canadian technical team that performed the specialized maintenance on reactor vessel internals, a team with security clearances, with certified expertise, with an 8-year safety record, had been recalled to Canada. The utility's chief operating officer informed federal regulators that finding and qualifying alternative personnel would take an estimated 4 to 6 months. The cost of that single postponement, replacement power purchases, extended operational modifications, regulatory compliance overhead, was estimated at $75 million. $75 million. For one facility, for one team. In New York and Maine, emergency room wait times increased sharply as Canadian nursing staff departed. Hospitals that had spent years integrating these professionals into their workflows, who knew the systems, who knew the patients, who knew the protocols, were suddenly running on skeleton crews. Governors began calling the White House. Republican governors who had supported Trump in every previous confrontation. One of them, publicly, on the record said, "My state has $12 billion in active energy projects that depend on Canadian skilled labor. The president's remarks have jeopardized every single one of them. I need those workers back, and calling them replaceable doesn't make it true. It makes us look foolish." Meanwhile, American technology companies began restructuring their employment models, converting Canadian engineers to international freelance contractors specifically to circumvent the new visa regulations. The policy designed to reduce American dependence on Canadian labor had instead created a shadow workforce operating entirely outside American regulatory oversight. The irony was so complete it was almost architectural. Trump had tried to bring workers inside the American system, and instead he had pushed them outside it entirely. In the financial sector, the analysis arrived quickly and without mercy. 3 major investment banks issued client notes within 48 hours of Carney's electron statement. One Deutsche Bank strategist, writing in language that would be quoted in every financial publication by the end of the week, wrote, "The North American supply chain is not a trade relationship. It is a circulatory system. What we are watching is not a policy dispute. It is an attempt to surgically remove an organ and replace it with a photograph of an organ. The patient is already symptomatic." Markets responded. The dollar weakened against a basket of allied currencies. Logistics stocks fell sharply. Border towns on the American side, communities whose entire economic identity was built on the daily flow of goods, services, and people between the two countries, reported revenue collapses that no emergency package could address quickly enough. And through all of it, Trump continued. He appeared at rallies. He held up AI statistics. He described artificial intelligence as, and these are his exact words, the perfect patriotic worker. No strikes, no borders, no benefits, no foreign citizenship. The crowd cheered, and in the silence between the cheers, the damage continued to accumulate. Because the thing Trump's advisors, the ones who still cared about accuracy over applause, knew and could not say publicly, was this: AI, in 2026, cannot perform complex pressure vessel maintenance on a nuclear reactor. AI cannot integrate into an EV battery management system that requires hands-on calibration in a factory environment. AI cannot hold the hand of a patient in a New York emergency room at 3 in the morning. AI cannot set a 40-ton steel column within a quarter inch of tolerance, 200 feet above a city street in a driving rain. These are not tasks that need to be automated. These are tasks that need to be done. And the people who knew how to do them, the people who had spent years acquiring the certifications, building the expertise, earning the trust of American employers who could not find equivalent domestic workers despite years of trying, were driving north. Back to Canada. Back to a country that had just announced expedited work permits for skilled tradespeople seeking employment across Europe, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the Gulf states. Back to a country that was paying a $20,000 retention bonus, funded directly from tariff revenue collected on American imports, to any skilled Canadian worker who returned home and committed to domestic projects for 2 years. The message was precise. If America does not want you, the rest of the world does, and Canada will pay you to come home. On September 11, 2026, the United States formally implemented new financial screening and security vetting procedures for all Canadian nationals entering the country, a protocol without precedent in modern North American history. Canadian citizens, people who had crossed that border freely for generations, people whose grandparents had fought alongside American soldiers, people who held joint professional certifications with American institutions, began to feel for the first time that they were being treated as citizens of a hostile state. The anger in Toronto and Vancouver was not political, it was personal. And Carney watched it, measured it, and chose still not to escalate emotionally. Because he understood with the cold clarity of a former central banker who had navigated the 2008 financial crisis that Trump wanted an emotional response. An emotional response would give Trump justification. An emotional response would let Trump reframe the story. So instead, Carney accelerated what his government was calling the North American Independence Roadmap. Canada deepened economic partnerships with Europe. Canada signed new strategic agreements across Asia. Canada positioned itself not as a nation that had been abandoned by its neighbor, but as a nation that had outgrown its need for that neighbor's validation. And American corporations caught between a White House pursuing nationalist economics and a Canadian government controlling the critical minerals and energy infrastructure that those corporations needed to function, began to understand something that no policy brief had adequately prepared them for. They were not caught in a trade dispute. They were caught in a civilizational argument about what relationships between nations actually mean, about whether interdependence is a vulnerability or a foundation, about whether the most powerful country in the world can afford to mistake dominance for self-sufficiency. By the end of autumn 2026, the pressure had reversed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, the way economic consequences always reverse, through accumulation, through arithmetic, through the slow and inevitable victory of reality over rhetoric. Energy prices rose. Skilled labor shortages spread across multiple sectors simultaneously. Border communities on the American side reported revenue declines that no political messaging could obscure. And even Trump's own voters, the working-class Americans who had cheered the loudest when he called Canadian workers replaceable, began asking a question that no rally speech could answer. If everything is getting better, why does life keep getting more expensive? In the White House, Trump looked at AI deployment statistics and domestic workforce training projections and still believed, that he was fighting for America's future. In Ottawa, Carney looked at the same data and understood something Trump could not. No nation becomes a superpower through isolation. No economy achieves self-sufficiency by dismantling the relationships that made it function. And no leader, no matter how large the crowd, no matter how loud the applause, can declare economic independence from the physical infrastructure of interdependence and expect the infrastructure to simply stop existing. The cranes stopped moving in Texas. The reactors waited in Pennsylvania. The assembly lines stalled in Michigan. The emergency rooms stretched thin in New York. And somewhere in all of that, in the gap between what Trump promised and what reality delivered, was the answer to the question that had haunted the entire confrontation from the moment it began. Computers don't need visas. 7 words that revealed with perfect clarity exactly what the President of the United States believed about the people who build his country. That they are a cost, that they are a liability, that they are, at some sufficient level of technological advancement, unnecessary. And here is the thing about that belief. It is not just wrong about Canada. It is wrong about everyone. It is wrong about the Pennsylvania steelworker Trump claimed to be protecting. It is wrong about the Michigan auto worker Trump promised to champion. It is wrong about every human being whose labor, expertise, and years of training Trump reduced to a line item that could be optimized away by an algorithm. Because the moment a government begins to see people, any people, as procurement problems, it has stopped governing. It is merely managing inventory. And the inventory, the skilled, certified, irreplaceable human beings who actually build the infrastructure of modern civilization, noticed. They noticed when they were called overrated. They noticed when they were called replaceable. They noticed when they were told they should feel grateful for the privilege of contributing their expertise to an economy that could not function without them. And they made a decision. Not in anger, not in retaliation, but in the quiet, dignified recognition that a person who knows what they are worth does not stay where they are told they are worth nothing. A welder named Mark, 12 years in Texas, an American truck, an American church, 14 American apprentices trained on his expertise, packed his tools, and drove north. He said, "I'm not angry, I'm hurt. Angry, I'd stay and fight. Hurt, I go home." An iron worker named Jean, 6 years in New York, a Queens apartment, a Lexington Avenue deli that taped a handwritten sign to its window that read, "We'll miss our Canadian boys. They is not replaceable to us," walked off a high-rise project on a Wednesday morning. He said, "I'm not grateful, I'm skilled. Grateful is what you feel when someone gives you something you didn't earn. I earned every inch of every beam I've ever set." These are not statistics. These are not trade policy outcomes. These are human beings. And the question that the entire confrontation between the United States and Canada in 2026 ultimately forces every one of us to answer, not as economists, not as political analysts, not as policy wonks, but as people, is this: what happens to a society that decides human beings are just another variable to be optimized? What happens to a democracy that outsources its moral calculation to an algorithm? What happens to a civilization that mistakes the cost of a person for their value? Because Trump's 7 words were not really about Canada. They were not really about visas. They were not really about trade or tariffs or labor markets or AI. They were about something older and something more dangerous. They were about the idea, the seductive, catastrophic, ultimately self-defeating idea, that power means never having to depend on anyone, that strength means never needing anything from outside your own borders, that a nation is greatest when it stands entirely, completely, magnificently alone. And Canada, through patience, through data, through the elegant weaponization of economic reality, demonstrated something that no press conference could have communicated as effectively as 7 months of consequences. No nation stands alone. Not in a world where electricity crosses borders invisibly. Not in a world where supply chains span continents. Not in a world where the expertise required to maintain a nuclear reactor, or wire a skyscraper, or calibrate a battery management system cannot be manufactured by executive order and cannot be replaced by the week after next. Trump tried to close the border to people. The electrons kept moving. Trump tried to replace human expertise with a campaign promise. The cranes stopped. Trump tried to tell the world that computers don't need visas. And the world slowly, expensively, irrevocably replied, neither do consequences. The photograph that defined the moment was not taken in a summit hall. It was not taken at a rally. It was taken on a job site in Midland, Texas. An American project manager, 30 years in the energy industry, never lost a project, never missed a deadline, standing in front of a stopped construction crane, a $400 million pipeline, 7 months behind schedule, no completion date. And he said, on the record, without a speechwriter, without a political handler, something that no American project manager had ever said before: we cannot finish this job, not late, not over budget, we cannot finish it at all. The people who knew how to do the critical welds are gone, and there is nobody left in this country who can do what they did. He did not say this to hurt Trump. He did not say this to help Canada. He said it because it was true. And the truth, in the end, is the only thing that the market and history ever really scores. Computers don't need visas, but pipelines need welders. Reactors need engineers. Hospitals need nurses. And nations, even the most powerful nation in the history of the world, need each other. That is not weakness. That is not dependence. That is not the failure of American greatness. That is what greatness actually looks like, when it is honest enough to know what it cannot do alone, wise enough to build relationships that fill that gap, and humble enough to recognize that the person standing across the border is not a cost to be eliminated. They are a partner without whom your cranes do not move. Please subscribe for daily updates on the story that Washington does not want you to understand.